The phone lit up on the marble kitchen counter, and with that single short message, Ethan Caldwell's marriage died on the spot. Suite 1408 like last time. Ethan did not touch the phone right away. He stood still, a cup of coffee, cooling in his hand, the Miami evening light spilling through the glass doors and making the kitchen feel suddenly too wide, too empty. People like to believe life-changing moments arrive with explosions, with screaming arguments, or tears that break everything apart. But sometimes they arrive exactly like this, quiet, precise, leaving no room for denial. The sender was Grant Holloway. The name needed no explanation. Grant Holloway, Chief Operating Officer of a fast-rising logistics conglomerate. A familiar face on charity stages, a man the media loved to call the model, modern leader. Powerful, charismatic, untouchable. And now, the man sleeping with Ethan's wife. Sienna Caldwell was still in the shower. The water ran steadily. Steam fogged the glass. She had forgotten to take her phone with her, a mistake so small it would have been laughable if it had not just torn a man's life clean in half. Ethan placed the phone back exactly where it had been, adjusted the angle until it looked untouched. His hands did not shake. His breathing stayed calm. On the surface, he was still Ethan Caldwell, Director of Risk and Compliance, a man who lived by discipline, numbers, and control. But somewhere deep inside, a gear had snapped, and when one gear breaks, the entire machine eventually follows. Sienna stepped out, wrapped in a towel, hair dripping, her face relaxed. She smiled at him, the familiar smile of 11 years of marriage. Ethan looked up from his laptop, spreadsheets still open like a perfect disguise. "What time is the donor meeting tomorrow?" he asked evenly. Sienna glanced at her phone, completely at ease. 9:30 in the morning. Then, as if it were nothing more than a passing detail, she added, "I will be home late tonight. Gala planning meeting." Ethan nodded. "No problem. I will grab dinner with a friend." It was the first lie he had ever told his wife, and it came out frighteningly easily. Instead of meeting anyone, Ethan drove downtown. He parked across from the building where Sienna worked and sat in the shadows, watching his own life from a distance. When she appeared polished and professional in a fitted dress, the first thing Ethan noticed was not her beauty, but the precision of her movements. She did not head toward the parking garage. She turned left, walked 3 blocks, and disappeared into the lobby of a beachfront hotel. Ethan sat in his car for a long time. Part of him wanted to get out, march inside, take the elevator up to that room, and force the truth into the open. But that part of him was the weakest one. Ethan had learned early that emotion was the first thing you had to eliminate if you wanted to win. He started the car and drove in the opposite direction. The bar was tucked between 2 low buildings, its yellow lights tired and dim. It was where Ethan and Sienna used to go when they were young, broke, and convinced love was enough to beat anything. The bartender was still there, older, slower, but with the same sharp eyes. "Bourbon neat," Ethan said. He drank the burn spreading down his throat. The bartender looked at him and did not ask questions. Some pain does not need explaining. That night, Ethan called Noah Briggs, a former cop, who now made a living uncovering truths other people paid to bury. The call was short, clean, emotionless. "I need surveillance. Discreet. Fast. And solid enough to stand in court if it comes to that." "Who is the target?" Noah asked. "My wife and Grant Holloway." There was a pause on the other end. Then Noah exhaled slowly. "Are you sure you want to know?" Ethan stared through the windshield city lights, stretching across the glass in distorted lines. He had been underestimated his entire life. A quiet man always behind the scenes, never loud. No one noticed where his real power lived. "I already know," Ethan said. "I just need proof." From that moment on, everything changed. Ethan remained the attentive husband each morning, the composed man at social events. But somewhere deeper, another version of him had awakened, a man who did not crave loud revenge or public shouting, a man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He was looking for the truth, and once the truth surfaced, it would burn everything down. The phone vibrated close to midnight, and a single image was enough for Ethan Caldwell to understand there was no turning back. In the photo, Sienna was smiling. Not the polite smile she reserved for donors, but a private one, soft and unguarded. She stood inside a hotel elevator, her hand resting on another man's chest. Grant Holloway. The elevator doors were about to close, the moment frozen forever. Ethan sat on the bed in the dark, the only light coming from the phone screen. He did not curse. He did not throw the phone. He did not punch the wall. He simply stared. And in that silence, a brutal truth took shape. This was not a moment of weakness, not an impulsive mistake. This was a parallel life maintained through systematic deception. The next morning, Ethan still woke up early. He made coffee for two. He placed Sienna's cup exactly where she liked it. When she came downstairs, her hair still damp, her face tired from a long night, he was already there, calm as ever. "You came home late," he said lightly. Sienna paused for half a second, then smiled. "The meeting ran long. You know how it is with the gala coming up, everyone is on edge." Ethan nodded. He had always known how to make people believe they were in control. In truth, they were the ones being guided. After Sienna drove away, Ethan stood by the window for a long time, watching her car disappear. It felt like watching someone leave without realizing it was the last time something still existed. Around noon, Noah Briggs called back. His voice was low, direct. "I have enough now for you to have no doubts at all." They met in a small office near the harbor. No sign outside, no glass walls. A place designed to keep secrets. Noah set a thick folder on the desk and opened his laptop. The images cut like blades. Sienna and Grant entering a hotel. Leaving together the next morning. Room charges for two. Timestamps matching the meetings Sienna had described. Another photo showed Grant's hand on her back as if it belonged there. 7 months, Noah said. At least 7 months. Ethan did not ask anything else. He already knew the answer would not make it easier. What suffocated him was not the length of time, but how effortlessly Sienna had lived 2 lives. She had not simply lied to him. She had built an entire system to do it. But Noah was not finished. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There is something else you need to see." The screen shifted to spreadsheets, numbers, money flows, company names that sounded harmless but kept reappearing. Noah pointed. Shell companies, used to inflate vendor costs, especially event contractors. Ethan felt his heart slow as the pieces locked together with terrifying precision. Grant Holloway was not just sleeping with his wife. He was laundering money, using Gala's charities and backstage contracts to hide dirty cash. And Sienna, whether she knew it or not, was standing at the center of that machine. "You are being underestimated," Noah continued as if reading Ethan's thoughts. "They think you are just the quiet husband and office guy who will not cause trouble. But you are not." Ethan stared at the screen, his gaze turning cold. He had spent his career in gray zones where truth was bent by power and money. He knew the scent of collapse long before it happened. That night when Sienna returned home, Ethan was already in bed. She slipped in beside him, gently placing a hand on his chest, a gesture that had once been familiar, comforting. Now it made him want to pull away. "I am tired," he said, turning his back. "I have an early presentation tomorrow." Sienna exhaled, more relieved than she realized. In the darkness, she typed messages. Ethan knew it. He closed his eyes but did not sleep. He memorized everything: her breathing, the pauses between texts, the artificial calm of a house that had lost its soul. Somewhere in the city, Grant Holloway believed he was safe. He believed everything was under control. He believed men like Ethan stayed silent and endured. He was wrong, because from this moment on, Ethan was no longer just a man being betrayed. He was a man preparing to expose the truth. And when the truth is dragged into the light, it does not ask permission. The next photo arrived on a rainy afternoon, and this time it gave Ethan Caldwell no chance to lie to himself. In the image, Sienna stood in front of a mirror inside a luxurious fitting room, a dress hugging her back, while Grant Holloway stood behind her, leaning in to whisper something near her ear. Her eyes in the reflection showed no panic at all. They were calm, familiar, as if this were a place she had stood in many times before. Ethan sat in his office surrounded by glass steel and cold white light. Colleagues passed by, still seeing him as the steady, reliable man, the one entrusted with the most sensitive files, because everyone knew he would never let emotion interfere. No one knew that in that moment he was learning how to breathe again inside a life that had just been torn in two. The following days passed with a terrifying sense of routine. By day, Ethan was the director of risk management, sending emails in a neutral tone, leading meetings with flawless precision. By night, he became an observer, receiving each piece of evidence and arranging them like chess pieces on a board he had never asked to play on, but now had no choice but to win. Noah Briggs worked without pause. Each report was detailed, dry, and stripped of emotion. Times, locations, room numbers, receipts, repeating patterns that could not be denied. Ethan realized something that made his blood run cold. Sienna was not rushing. She was scheduling, optimizing, coordinating her time between work, marriage, and the hidden relationship with the skill of a professional event planner. One morning, as Ethan adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, Sienna stepped out of the dressing room wearing a deep blue dress he had never seen before. She turned slightly and asked what he thought. Ethan looked at the dress, the perfect cut at the waist, the way she waited for his approval. He knew exactly where it had come from. Noah had sent the receipt. A high-end boutique in the design district paid for with Grant's card. "You look beautiful," Ethan said. And what frightened him most was that he was not lying. For a brief moment, Sienna hesitated, as if she sensed something out of rhythm. Then she smiled, kissed his cheek, and the artificial world kept spinning. That evening, they attended a dinner with several of Ethan's business partners. Sienna was flawless as always. She remembered spouses' names, asked about children, laughed at the right moments, listened at the right times. The men at the table looked at Ethan with quiet admiration. A perfect wife. A marriage worth envying. No one could see the images playing in Ethan's mind. The elevator, the hotel hallway, Grant's hand on Sienna's back, doors closing. On the drive home, Sienna placed her hand on his thigh and spoke with concern. "You were so quiet tonight. Is everything okay?" Ethan shook his head. "Just tired. Work has been heavy lately." She leaned closer, suggesting a shared bath, a massage, her voice softening into a promise. The thought of those hands that had touched another man made Ethan's stomach tighten. "Another time," he said. "I need to prepare for my presentation in the morning." Sienna nodded, and in the darkness a flicker of relief crossed her face. Ethan saw it all, and that relief was the deepest cut of all. Late at night, after Sienna had fallen asleep, Ethan reopened the reports. He did not just read them with his eyes. He read them with the instincts of a man who had seen collapses before. Then Noah sent another file. Contracts, event vendors, inflated fees, money looping through companies no one paid attention to. All of it led back to the same name, Grant Holloway. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. A thought surfaced, clear and cold. Grant was not just using Sienna. He was using her work as a link in the chain. Whether she knew it or not, she had been pulled into a game far bigger than she ever imagined. Across the city, Grant lived inside the illusion of safety that comes with constant victory. He believed power protected everything. He believed men like Ethan stayed silent, and endured. But Ethan Caldwell had never been a man who simply endured. He understood systems, and a man who understands the system knows exactly where to place his hand to make it collapse. Ethan did not tell anyone that he had met his wife's lover's wife, because that moment was not a meeting. It was a collision between two lives already fractured. Her name was Lila Moore, and the first time Ethan saw her in a small riverside cafe, he immediately understood why Grant Holloway had never left her. Lila was not striking in an obvious way. Her beauty was quiet and sharp, like deep water that hides its movement beneath the surface. She arrived 10 minutes early, sitting straight with both hands neatly resting beside a cup of coffee she had not touched. When Ethan walked in, her eyes lifted at once without surprise or suspicion, only a carefully contained exhaustion. "You are Ethan, right?" she said calmly. "Sienna's husband." Ethan nodded. "And you are Lila." No one asked why they were there. No explanations were needed. The truth hung between them, heavy enough to remain unspoken. Lila broke the silence first. "I have known for a long time. Not proof, just instinct. The way Grant disappeared, the way he guarded his phone like part of his body, the way he looked at me like an obligation instead of a choice." Ethan listened without interrupting, seeing Sienna's image layered over Lila's words, two versions of the same betrayal. "What are you going to do?" Lila asked, her gaze sharpening. "Divorce, or pretend you do not know?" Ethan met her eyes. "I am going to end everything, not just the affair." Lila raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan slowly placed a thin envelope on the table. Inside were the first copies Noah had sent invoices shell companies, money cycling through charity events Sienna had managed. Lila did not touch it at once. She studied Ethan as if weighing his credibility. "I work in risk management. Ethan said my job is to see what others overlook. Grant did not just betray us. He is gambling with a lot of other people." Lila opened the envelope and read quickly, her eyes missing nothing. When she set the papers down, her hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained chillingly steady. "He is collapsing," she whispered. "And you know it." Ethan nodded. "And I need someone beside me when it happens." Lila leaned back, a fragile smile, appearing not joy or sadness, only clarity after prolonged deception. "What do you want me to do?" That night, Sienna came home later than usual. She removed her shoes, hung her coat, then paused when she saw Ethan sitting in the living room with the lights off. "You are not asleep yet?" she asked, forcing casualness. Ethan looked up. "Not yet." Silence stretched. Sienna slowed, sensing something had shifted. "Are you okay?" she asked. Ethan stood and stepped toward her, stopping just short of touching. "I am thinking about things I believed were certain, but were not." Sienna swallowed and smiled faintly. "Everyone feels that way sometimes." Ethan did not return the smile. Sometimes, he said, people have to choose whether they remain victims or rewrite the ending. Sienna did not understand, but fear had already begun to take root. Elsewhere in the city, Grant Holloway raised a glass, laughing amid praise, unaware that the two most important women in his life no longer stood with him, unaware that the man he had always underestimated was methodically dismantling the system that had protected him. Ethan did not hate loudly. His true power lay in patience, in waiting and allowing his opponent to take one confident step after another until the ground beneath them vanished. And as night settled, Ethan knew the game had officially begun. The invitation to the charity gala arrived like a challenge wrapped in gold foil. Ethan held the card, read each line slowly, then placed it on the kitchen counter. Sienna stood behind him, leaning against the doorway, her voice light and bright, as if it were just another routine event. "This is the biggest fundraiser of the year," she said. "Grant is the primary sponsor. He wants me to oversee everything." Ethan did not turn around. He stared at his reflection in the glass, a man everyone believed was gentle, quiet, safe. No one knew that beneath that surface lived someone who had spent years cleaning up the messes of more powerful men. This time, the mess was not his. Great Ethan said calmly, so calm that Sienna felt relieved. "I know you will be busy for the next few weeks." "I understand," he replied. He always understood. That was exactly why she never suspected him. The following days unfolded like a perfectly staged performance. By day, Ethan sat in board meetings presenting risk assessments and warning about unsustainable financial patterns, never mentioning that he was describing Grant Holloway's empire without saying his name. By night, he met Lila in dimly lit cafes, where soft voices carried decisions that would destroy lives. "Grant will appear as a hero," Lila said one rainy evening, her eyes no longer trembling like they had during their first meeting. "He will stand on stage, applauded, celebrated." Ethan nodded. "And that is exactly when he will be most vulnerable." Lila studied him as if only now seeing the man behind the quiet exterior. "How long have you been preparing for this?" "All my life," Ethan replied. "Before I used it to protect the system. Now I will use it to expose a rotten one." Meanwhile, Sienna lived with a growing sense of unease. Grant began replying to messages more slowly. Meetings were postponed. Calls ended abruptly. When she asked, he smiled and blamed pressure. A major deal, minor legal issues. Nothing to worry about. Grant said, his hand resting on her waist. "You trust me, don't you?" Sienna nodded, but a crack had formed. She started watching Ethan more closely. His silence, his lack of questions, his absence of jealousy. What once felt safe now felt unsettling. One night while Sienna slept, Ethan sat alone in his office and opened an encrypted laptop. The screen filled with financial diagrams, arrows linking shell companies, money trails Grant believed invisible. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He felt no satisfaction, only weight. Justice did not always feel righteous. Sometimes it only felt necessary. Across the city, Grant stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie. He noticed the change in the boardroom, lately fewer smiles, colder eyes. Still, he believed he controlled everything. Money, women, men like Ethan Caldwell, men he assumed lived by rules and compliance. Grant did not realize that those very rules would crush him. The gala drew closer. Invitations were sent. The guest list read like a map of the city's power investors, politicians, people who believed they stood on solid ground. Ethan looked at the invitation one last time and slipped it into his jacket pocket. This was not just a party, it was the final stage, and this time he would not be waiting behind the curtain. Somewhere deep inside, Ethan accepted that after that night, none of them could return to who they were. But he also knew that truth, no matter how painful, was better than a lie that lasted a lifetime. When the clock struck 12 in the night, Ethan turned off the lights, stepped into the bedroom, and lay beside the woman who had betrayed him. He did not touch her. He simply closed his eyes and waited calmly for the moment when every mask would finally fall. The call came while Ethan was sitting in his car, and a single short sentence made the air inside feel heavy. Grant Holloway was looking for him. Ethan did not respond right away. He stared through the windshield as the city slid past under the lights, calm as if no storm were gathering ahead. Noah was on the line, his voice low and urgent. "Grant has started asking about you. Not directly, but he is probing. Asking about your connections in finance. Asking why recent risk reports align too closely with his internal problems." Ethan allowed a faint smile. So Grant had finally smelled danger. "Good," Ethan said. "Let him look." At the same time, Sienna sat inside the fitting room of a prestigious designer, staring at her reflection. The gala dress clung perfectly to her body, flawless enough to convince her she was still in control. But her hand trembled slightly when her phone vibrated. It was Grant. His voice was fast stripped of its usual confidence. "I need you tonight. There are things I have to say in person." Sienna heard the tension in every word. She agreed and ended the call. When she looked back at the mirror for the first time in months, she was no longer sure she liked what she saw. In a quiet bar, Lila sat across from Ethan, the low light revealing a new decisiveness in her face. "He is panicking," she said. "Grant has never panicked like this." Ethan nodded. "When someone used to control starts losing it, they do the stupidest things." "Are you sure you are safe?" Lila asked. "Not for you. For me. For Sienna." Ethan looked at her, his gaze darkening. "I have planned for that. Safeguards are in place. If Grant crosses a line, everything activates immediately." Lila fell silent, then spoke slowly. "You are not the man Grant thinks you are." "No one ever has," Ethan replied. That night, Sienna entered Grant's penthouse and felt the difference instantly. No music, no wine. Grant stood by the window, shirt-wrinkled tie thrown over a chair. He turned as she approached. "We are in trouble," he said bluntly. "Someone is digging. I do not know who, but they know too much." A chill ran through Sienna. "Have you told anyone?" "Your wife, your lawyers." Grant shook his head. "Not yet. But you need to be careful. Do not contact your husband for now. He works in finance. He may know more than we think." Sienna stiffened. "Ethan." She left the penthouse, shaking Grant's words colliding with memories of Ethan's unsettling calm in recent days. She remembered his eyes. No anger, no pain. Just a quiet emptiness that terrified her. When she got home, Ethan was sitting and reading. He looked up and smiled faintly. "You are home earlier than I expected." She studied him, searching for something. Jealousy? Suspicion? Anything. There was nothing. Just a man so composed it felt cold. "Have you ever thought you underestimated yourself?" Sienna asked, her voice unsteady. Ethan closed the book. "Perhaps," he said. "But you were not the only one." The answer kept Sienna awake all night. Meanwhile, Grant made another call to someone who handled problems. His voice dropped into command. "Find out everything about Ethan Caldwell. I want to know who he really is." The reply was brief. "You will have answers soon." Grant did not know that this process had already been anticipated. Every step he took, every call, every inquiry was being logged not by obvious cameras, but by systems Ethan had once helped build, systems designed to protect men like Grant. This time, Ethan stood on the other side. As dawn filtered through the curtains, Ethan rose and adjusted his collar in the mirror. He knew that today would be the day Grant unknowingly signed his own sentence. The game had entered its final phase, and the pieces once thought weakest were beginning to reveal their true faces. The morning of the gala began with a message that made Sienna drop her phone onto the floor. "Do not do anything reckless. Everything is out of control now." She sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding painfully. The message was from Grant, but this time it carried no promises or commands. It was a disguised plea, a weakness she had never seen in the man who always claimed control. In the bathroom mirror, her pale face stared back at her. Sienna realized she had lived too long in two roles, the perfect wife and the secret lover, and now both were collapsing at the same time. Across the city, Ethan walked into his office, as he did every day. White lights, cold stone floors, familiar greetings. No one knew that inside his briefcase lay the key to an earthquake. He sat down, opened his computer, and reviewed the carefully arranged data one final time. Everything was in place. Every path led to a single point. Noah called his voice tense but steady. "Grant's people hired an investigation firm. They are digging into your past, but they are touching things they should not touch. Ethan remained calm. Let them dig. The deeper the ground, the bigger the collapse. At midday, Ethan met Lila for the last time before the gala. The cafe was busier than usual, yet among the crowd, they sat facing each other like strangers. Tonight, Lila said softly, "He will try to save face. Grant will not run. He believes he can still turn this around." Ethan looked toward the window. "And that will be his greatest mistake." Lila took a deep breath. "After tonight, all our lives will be different." Ethan met her eyes. Different does not mean worse. Sometimes destruction is necessary to build something honest. Evening descended slowly. The city dressed itself in familiar glamour. Sienna stepped into the dressing room and put on the gown prepared weeks ago. Everything was flawless, yet it felt like wearing a confession. Ethan appeared at the doorway and looked at her with a calm that bordered on cruel. "Are you ready?" Sienna nodded, her voice trembling. "Have you ever wondered what would happen if everything were exposed?" Ethan stepped closer and gently adjusted the neckline of her dress. He whispered that he had lived his entire life with that question. In the car to the event, Sienna said nothing. The city slid past the window like a film in which she was no longer the lead. Ethan drove in silence, every breath steady. He was not nervous. He was exactly where he belonged. At the same time, Grant stood in his private office staring at the guest list, powerful names, familiar faces. He told himself that if he survived tonight, everything would stabilize. A speech, a few handshakes, the right smiles. But when his phone vibrated and Lila's name appeared, Grant did not answer. He did not realize that this silence was his sentence. At the venue, lights blazed, music swelled, laughter mixed with the sound of clinking glasses. Ethan and Sienna entered together, drawing admiring glances. A perfect couple, at least on the surface. Lila appeared across the room, her eyes meeting Ethan's. No words were needed. Everything was ready. Grant stepped onto the stage, his practiced smile in place. He spoke of vision, of values, of grand ideas. The audience listened. Sienna stood below, her hands ice cold. Ethan watched the stage. In that moment, he was no longer a betrayed husband, no longer a man in the background. He was the only person in the room who knew exactly what would happen next. And when Grant raised his hand to signal the presentation to begin, Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. The masks were about to fall. The screen behind the stage lit up, but what appeared first was not the tribute video Grant had been expecting. It was a still image, sharp and undeniable. The entire hall fell silent. Grant remained on stage, his smile frozen before he could even understand what was happening. The next image appeared, a hotel corridor, a closing door, then a data extract, numbers and text, cold and mercilessly precise. Sienna felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the screen, then at Ethan. He stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. No surprise, no satisfaction, only the calm of someone who had known the ending for a long time. Grant let out a nervous laugh, trying to recover. "There must be a technical mistake. Let us pause this." But the video did not stop. A narration filled the room, low, clear, devoid of emotion. A carefully prepared voice guiding each piece into place. Shell companies, inflated invoices, circular money flows, charity events exploited as cover. Murmurs spread, eyes turned. Some people stood abruptly. Investors recognized numbers they knew all too well. Grant stepped back, then another step, scanning the room for support, finding none. Faces that once smiled at him were now cold. Sienna trembled and whispered, "Ethan, please tell me you are not involved in this." Ethan turned to her. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a deep sadness. "I am involved with the truth," he said quietly, "and the truth does not wait for anyone." On the screen, the final images appeared: message threads, promises secret meetings. No names were needed, no explanations required. Everyone understood. Grant shouted, "Turn it off now." But at that moment, the large doors at the back of the hall opened. Men in dark suits entered, their movements decisive. No introductions, no spectacle. Their presence alone shattered the room. Grant turned and tried to run. 2 steps, only 2. A hand landed on his shoulder. "Mr. Holloway," a voice said, "we need to speak with you." Grant screamed for his lawyer, for the people who once dined with him. No one answered. Phones were raised, every moment recorded. Sienna collapsed into her chair. Her world fell apart before her eyes. She looked at Ethan as if he were a stranger. He had known not today, not yesterday, but long before. Lila stood from her seat across the room and walked forward, each step steady. When she passed Grant, there was no pain left in her eyes, only an ending. On stage, Grant was handcuffed. The sound of metal clicked sharply, brief, but enough to close a false empire. Ethan did not watch for long. He turned to Sienna. "There are moments," he said, "when silence destroys everything. I chose not to be silent anymore." Sienna broke down. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg, but no words remained that could save her. Ethan walked out of the hall with Lila. Camera flashes exploded, questions shouted, but he did not answer. He did not need to. The truth had spoken for him. Outside, the night air was cool. Lila stopped and took a deep breath. "It is over," she said. Ethan looked up at the city sky. "No," he replied. "It is just beginning." In that moment, he did not feel victory, only relief. The weight of knowing the truth had finally been set down. Behind them, the chaos continued. But Ethan knew that from this moment on, no one would ever underestimate him again. Not because of the power he revealed, but because of the calm of a man willing to drag light into the darkness where it once ruled. And that was what truly frightened people. The next morning, Grant Holloway's name dominated every headline, but the name people whispered most was Ethan's. The news spread like fire. Videos from the gala flooded every platform, flashes of light, the sound of metal locking around wrists, the collapse of a man who once stood at the top. Yet amid the chaos, Ethan disappeared from public view. He sat in his living room with the curtains half drawn, dim light sliding across the floor. His phone vibrated non-stop, calls from colleagues, from people who once underestimated him, from numbers he had never saved. Ethan did not answer. He needed silence, not to hide, but to listen to what remained inside himself. Sienna sat across from him, hands tightly clasped, eyes swollen from crying through the night. She was no longer the confident woman who moved through bright rooms with ease. She was only a tired human being, stripped bare, facing the consequences of her choices. "I did not know," Sienna said, her voice hoarse, "about the money, about the rest. I only know that I was wrong." Ethan looked at her for a long time. There was no anger, no contempt, only the distance of someone who had already gone too far to return. "Wrong is not a single moment," he said. "Wrong is a series of choices, and you chose for a very long time." Sienna lowered her head. "I thought you would shout, or at least blame me." Ethan shook his head. "When I shout, it means I still have hope. Now I do not." Elsewhere, Lila walked into her lawyer's office with steady steps. She had not slept, but her eyes were no longer lost. Grant was being held for investigation accounts, frozen associates turning away one by one. Lila signed the documents with a decisiveness that surprised even herself. She thought of Ethan not as a conspirator, but as someone who had helped her face the truth, not for revenge, but to end a lie that had lasted too long. That afternoon, Ethan was asked to speak with investigators. The room was bright and plain, not threatening. The questions were careful about how he obtained the information, about his role, about his motive. Ethan answered clearly, without deflection or defense. I did not do this for personal gain. I did it because the truth had been buried too long and because people were being hurt without knowing why. One investigator looked at him differently then. He understood. Some people do not need to be heroes. They only need to sleep at night. When Ethan left the building, rain had begun to fall, steady drops cooling the tense air. He stood beneath the awning, feeling the chill on his skin. For the first time in months, he felt light. Sienna moved out quietly. No arguments, no pleading. Just suitcases rolling across the floor, carrying 12 years of memories. Before she left, she stopped at the door. "I loved you," Sienna said. "Maybe in a selfish way, but I loved you." Ethan nodded. He believed her. But love is not enough to save a lie fed by repeated wrong choices. The door closed. The house fell silent. Ethan walked through the rooms, touching the photographs on the walls. Smiles, trips, promises that once felt real. He did not tear them down. He simply put them away. Memories did not need destruction. They only needed their proper place. That evening, Ethan received a message from Lila, only one line. "Are you okay?" Ethan stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I am learning how to be." Outside, the city kept moving. New stories began. Empires collapsed. Those who believed power could hide everything learned otherwise. Truth does not need to shout. It only needs to stand where it belongs and let time do the rest. Ethan stood by the window, watching the rain fall, and for the first time after everything he no longer felt underestimated, not because the world had changed its view of him, but because he no longer needed anyone's approval to know who he was. The first court hearing unfolded in heavy silence, and a single look from Grant was enough to show that he finally understood when he had lost. Ethan sat in the back row, unobtrusive, not seeking anyone's attention. He was not the main witness, not the plaintiff. On paper, he was simply an information provider. Yet everyone in the room knew that without him, this day would not exist. Grant appeared in a light gray suit, his face far more hollow than the images that once filled glossy magazines. As the lawyer read the charges, words like fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering echoed coldly through the courtroom. Grant did not object. There was nothing left to contest. Every path had already been sealed. Across the room, Lila sat upright, hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on the judge. No trembling, no doubt. She had endured the worst days and emerged with a composure that commanded respect. When the session recessed, Grant turned his head. His gaze settled on Ethan. There was no hatred, no anger, only a belated exhaustion. Ethan gave a slight nod. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that everything was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, questions flying. Ethan passed them without stopping. He had already spoken enough through action. Lila followed her steps steady. She turned to Ethan and said, "Thank you." Ethan replied softly that they had saved themselves. The weeks that followed moved slowly but decisively. News updates arrived daily. Accounts frozen. Projects cancelled. Names once linked to Grant quietly vanished. An empire did not collapse with an explosion. It dissolved in the silence of those who no longer wished to be associated. Ethan returned to work, but in a different position. No one saw him as merely someone who followed procedure anymore. Meetings listened to him more closely. His warnings were no longer dismissed as excessive caution. He did not need to announce change. Everyone could feel it. One evening, Ethan received an invitation to dinner from Lila. Not to discuss legal matters, just a simple meal. They sat in a small restaurant with soft candlelight, never mentioning Grant. They talked about Lila's new work, about plans to leave the city for a while, about ordinary things. At times, silence lingered, comfortable and unforced. Ethan realized he no longer had to brace himself to appear strong. With Lila, he could simply be himself. "Do you regret it?" Lila asked. Ethan considered. "No. He only regretted not trusting his instincts sooner, but perhaps things had to reach this point before he was ready to change. Lila smiled and said that sometimes collapse is an invitation to live again. In another city, Sienna began a new job. No bright lights, no parties. Her days passed quietly. Some nights she lay awake remembering the old house, remembering the man who had loved her with endless patience. But time does not return. It only moves forward carrying its lessons. Ethan understood that. He no longer checked news about her not out of resentment, but because he had truly let go. One morning, Ethan stood on his balcony watching the city wake. Early sunlight reflected off buildings that once carried Grant's name. Now they were just concrete and glass anonymous. He took a deep breath. His life was no longer defined by betrayal, no longer by the role of victim. He had crossed that line. Some stories do not end with triumphant victory. They end with quiet peace, and sometimes that is the most valuable ending of all. Ethan stepped back inside, closed the balcony door, and carried with him the certainty that this time he was moving forward, leaving every shadow behind. 3 months after the final court hearing, Ethan realized a simple truth that was not easy to accept. Silence was no longer emptiness. It had become the space where he could breathe. That morning began with a brief email from the board of directors. A promotion offer, no ceremony, no lengthy praise, just a delayed acknowledgement that they had relied on him far more than they ever admitted. Ethan finished reading, closed his laptop, and did not rush to reply. Power, when it arrives too late, no longer overwhelms. He drove out of the city, the highway stretching ahead, the sky opening wide. For the first time in a long while, he was not pulled back by obligation, by a marriage that had already died, or by the role of fixing other people's mistakes. There was only him and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. At a small roadside cafe, Ethan met Lila. No elaborate planning, no formalities, just a short message saying that if he was free, she was there. Lila looked different, not in appearance, but in presence. Lighter, less guarded. She spoke about working with victims from Grant's case, people who had lost everything: money, trust, even their voices. She did not speak with pity. She spoke like someone who had finally found a reason to get up each morning. "I do not want to live just to prove that I was right," Lila said. "I want to live so that things like this do not happen again." Ethan listened and realized he was changing too. He no longer wanted to defeat anyone. He only wanted to live in alignment with what he knew was right. They sat there for a long time. Silences came and went, unforced, unfilled. Their connection no longer came from shared pain, but from quiet respect. Somewhere else, Sienna began to adjust to her new life. A small apartment, an ordinary job. No one knew who she used to be. No one cared. On lonely nights, she stared into the mirror and saw a different woman, less ambitious, fewer illusions, but more alone. Some things once lost are never recovered. She did not call Ethan again, not out of pride, but because she understood that some doors close so others can have peace. Ethan understood that too. He carried no bitterness, only mature acceptance. Some people enter our lives to teach us a lesson, not to walk with us to the end. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the old house. It was cleaner, quieter, more empty. He removed the last remaining photographs, not in anger, but with respect for a former version of himself. He did not destroy the past. He closed it gently. As dusk fell, Lila stood beside him on the porch. No talk of the future, no promises, no commitments. Just two people who had been betrayed now choosing to stand next to each other with clarity. "Are you afraid?" Lila asked, afraid to start again. Ethan smiled. "Yes, but I am more afraid of continuing to live inside a lie." Lila nodded. Sometimes courage is not confrontation, but choosing to trust again without being naive. Night settled. The distant city lit up in small, scattered lights. Ethan felt it clearly now. He was no longer a man underestimated, not because the world had changed its view of him, but because he had learned to see himself more honestly. The game had ended long ago. What remained was not victory, but a new life quietly taking shape, without noise, without display, yet steadier than any power he had ever held. No one expected this story to end on such a quiet morning. Ethan stood alone in his new kitchen as early sunlight streamed through the window, spilling across the wooden counter that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. There were no urgent phone vibrations, no demanding emails, no powerful names that required careful navigation. There was only the gentle sound of water heating in the kettle and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. 1 year had passed since the night of the gala that changed everything. Grant Holloway was now just a name buried in court rulings and legal documents. The empire that once made an entire city bow had vanished as if it had never existed. Buildings changed ownership. Money was recovered. The people who once stood beside him quietly withdrew, pretending they had never known him at all. Sienna had left the city long ago. No farewell, no attempt at further explanation. Ethan heard that she was living a simpler, quieter life now. No spotlight, no wrong choices disguised as emotion. He did not follow her story anymore, not out of coldness, but because he had learned when to let go. Lila walked into the kitchen and placed 2 glasses on the table. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not need to. They had passed the stage of speaking every thought aloud. Some relationships mature in silence. "You have a talk today, don't you?" Lila asked softly. Ethan nodded. A small workshop. No big stage. No bright lights. Just people who wanted to learn how to recognize risk, how to see the truth before it was too late. Lila smiled and said she thought they would listen to him. Ethan looked at her and realized he was no longer the man who had once been underestimated. Not because he had proven his power, but because he had learned how to use it without needing to display it. At the venue, Ethan stood before a room of unfamiliar faces. No one knew his past. No one knew the story behind him, and that made him feel lighter. He did not speak about betrayal. He did not mention Grant's name. He did not reference the gala. He spoke about one thing, only the truth. The truth does not always arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it comes quietly hidden in small details we choose to ignore. And silence in the face of those details is the most dangerous thing of all. People listened not because his voice was loud, but because every word came from lived experience. The talk ended with applause that was not thunderous, but sincere. Ethan stepped away, knowing he had traveled very far, just to return to the most honest version of himself. That evening, Ethan and Lila walked along the river. The city lights reflected on the water, no longer carrying any name he despised. Just light, just the present. "Do you ever regret it?" Lila asked, stepping into all of this with me. Ethan thought for a moment. No. If I had never stepped into that darkness, I would never have known how strong I truly was, and I would never have met you this way. Lila squeezed his hand gently and said that sometimes the greatest losses lead us to the truest things. Night fell slowly. No drama, no final spectacle. Just the peace Ethan once believed he would never find again. This story is not meant to glorify revenge. It is a reminder that real strength does not come from humiliating someone in public, but from facing the truth, walking away from what no longer deserves you, and rebuilding a life from the ruins. If you have ever been underestimated, betrayed, or silent for too long in the face of something wrong, remember this power does not come from shouting. It comes from the calm of someone who knows exactly where they stand. And if this story resonated with you in any way, leave a comment to share your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe to continue exploring stories about truth awakening and lives rewritten with real strength.